I'm Noah Race, and welcome to In Focus. The issue of political violence was once again thrust into the limelight when President-elect Donald Trump narrowly survived an assassination attempt in July. Political violence and threats have been on the rise across the country, with 1 in 6 elected officials saying that they have experienced threats, according to the Brennan Center for Justice. Las Cruces in southern New Mexico are no different. I spoke with 2 local officials who shared their stories of death threats, homophobic slurs, anti-Semitic rhetoric, and a seemingly never-ending list of other messages that affect both sides of the aisle. Las Cruces City Councilor Joanna Bencomo says she is used to the critical comments that come with the job, but one incident in March crossed the line.
I was left a voicemail on my city hall phone that left a really explicit death threat. That's obviously been the worst, and it definitely left me shaken up.
Police say the threat came from an individual in El Paso and prompted the FBI to get involved. According to Bencomo, that person is going through the criminal justice system. She has received more messages saying that she deserves to be in prison, and others saying that they will battle her for the good of the city.
I care deeply about representation, that sometimes I do feel almost out of integrity with my values, and asking someone to run for office knowing what I know now, knowing what I have experienced, especially this year. Sometimes I feel like, what am I really inviting people into?
This fear is not unique to Las Cruces. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, more than 40% of local officials say they are less likely to run after receiving abusive language or threats. With 70% of elections going uncontested nationwide in 2024, people had less choices for who to vote for. While there are many reasons why people are driven to violence, one common explanation is the increase in intense rhetoric.
Research suggests that people are way more likely to commit acts of political violence when they have constructed a narrative that supports it.
NMSU professor Dr. Jeff Hunter has done research on how villainization of other politicians can lead to more political violence.
So on January 6, 2001, for example, lots of Trump supporters had constructed a narrative that somebody or something had stolen an election. And so they had a villain, and it led them to political violence. A lot of those emotions and things like that that people really cling to, they're easy for politicians to exploit.
Joanna Bencomo is far from being the only one receiving threats like these. Stories of district attorneys receiving racially motivated threats to county commissioners' houses being shot at can be seen all across New Mexico. State Representative from Alamogordo, John Block, is no exception.
I've gotten a lot of them, I'll tell you. I've gotten them from a guy who I got banned from the Capitol, actually, because of some of the threats that he's given to me. Death threats have come in as well. We've seen some sexual violence threats, some people threatening to rape, threatening to do all these other horrible things.
Block has received messages telling him that he should die, others making homophobic jabs and slews of anti-Semitic messages.
It ebbs and flows. So I would just say it could be related to the election. It also could be related to policy. But at the end of the day, some people have just harassed me because they read my Wikipedia page and they didn't like something that they read.
January 6th is often seen as an example of when political messages have gone too far. Block attended the rally, but says he never trespassed or broke any laws, and he rallied peacefully and patriotically.
What happened on January 6th was political violence. If you look at the people that led people into the Capitol building, that's totally not okay. People who were being violent, beating people, that is not okay. And I think any kind of violence is bad. But when I was in the crowd at the Ellipse on January 6th with tens of thousands of other patriotic Americans to rally with President Trump peacefully and patriotically, that's what it was.
Block also points to other examples of political violence, such as protests and riots after the killing of George Floyd.
We saw all the Black Lives Matter and Antifa protesters in cities like Minneapolis burning down businesses, and that's political violence. When we talk about political violence, I feel like it's important and it's critical to focus on all the aspects of everyone from left to right to center.
According to the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Group, only about 5% of the protests associated with the Black Lives Matter protests were violent. Dr. Hunter says that violent actions can lead to more violence, creating a tough cycle to break.
Anytime there's a weak enforcement of political violence, that tends to bring up more political violence later. So we are at risk of seeing violence that has happened lately not being punished or not being taken care of, not being investigated, causing more violence, because once people see that they can get away with it, they continue to do it.
Many government officials say that criticism is part of the job. However, having to worry about your safety is crossing the line.
People will say, well, you have to deal with it. You signed up for it. It comes with the job. Deal with it. And honestly, again, I think there's a huge difference between being critical of elected officials for the decisions they make. That is something I'm prepared for to deal with, like the public decisions that I'm making and being held accountable for them. There is a huge difference between that and sending threatening, violent, and abusive emails. And we did not sign up for that. No one did.
Illegal threats or intimidation face a maximum punishment of 6 months in jail and a $500 fine in New Mexico. But many experts say more still needs to be done to ensure everyone eligible to run or serve can do so safely. We now focus our attention to how political rhetoric may be playing a role in these threats and violence. Joining us for this conversation is NMCAFe's Executive Director and former field representative for Senator Martin Heinrich, Sylvia Ulloa. Sylvia, thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.
So just to start off, experts kind of agree that hateful rhetoric and divisive rhetoric has been on the rise across the country. What do you think is the driving force behind this increase?
So I think the one thing that we need to think, or that we need to acknowledge, is that violent rhetoric and political violence has been part of this country since its inception. I mean, we had a violent overthrow of the British government to become America, right? And so if we look at different places all along our history, we have seen political violence. We've, certainly when they were lynching people so that they couldn't go to vote, that was political violence. When they were, destroying people during the Red Scares, that was political violence. The civil rights, dogs going after protesters or beating people at lunch counters, those were all political violence. And so we need to look at what's happening now in that context, in that, it's happened a long time, and and we're just unfortunately in that period again. And I think that the fact that our elected leaders allow this speech is one reason why, that's the current context, right? The fact that we allow really coarse discourse and that it's encouraged, I think, is one big factor. Nobody has been really pushing back on that kind of political speech. And in fact, they're stoking it, right? Go after this person for not, because I don't agree with what they said, right? And it goes, I think, it's not gonna be super shocking or deep analysis, but part of our problem is social media and what it encourages, right? When we put algorithms that make outrage create virality, that's going to encourage more of that kind of language and rhetoric. And so there's a bunch of factors, but it's not like we haven't been here before. And one thing to think is that we've gotten out of those periods, right? And so I think that there's definitely a rise in that, and there's a lot of, serious factors that are easy factors like the social media, but there is also the fact that it's tolerated among one of the major political parties.
And one thing that really stuck out to me during my reporting is how many people this affects. It's affecting both sides of the aisle, and politics affects everybody, so in a way it's really affecting everybody in the country. Who do you think it's really harming the most?
I think it's harming our society, our society writ large, right? So if you can't have a civilized discussion, we can't ever get to the source of our problems. I think one thing that's really interesting in the new line of work that I'm in at CAFE is that part of that is having difficult conversations with each other. I think a lot of times we haven't been talking to each other, and so we don't understand who the other person, and that leaves space for people to demonize another person because they don't know them.
Yeah, I think we can go off of the demonization. campaigns are expensive. It's no secret. Campaigns are expensive. The political and the presidential campaign, billions of dollars were spent on that alone. Are there any monetary incentives for this kind of speech to exist?
I don't know if there are monetary incentives. I do think that there's incentive for growing, like trying to get people on your side, right? Like if you can demonize, like there's a whole discourse on, trans athletes and like who exactly is being hurt by that. It's such a minute, tiny little thing. You really hurt that community. And by hurting that community, you're pulling in a bunch of folks to your side of this argument, to this part, your side of this cultural war. And so I think that's a huge incentive, is that you just, we're really right now we're in a politics of division. Like how do we divide people against each other, and then we can do what we want, right? And so I think that is one of the big, that's the incentive, right? Like the incentive is to drive these wedges against people so that you can do what you want. So you can win your election, so that you can get your tax cut, you can do all these other things, right? And to me, I feel like if there's a monetary incentive at all, it probably is just like, getting your tax break or getting your government contract.
And local and state officials are immensely important to people's lives. And it also seems like national figures tend to get the most airtime. What role do national political figures play in this rhetoric?
Oh, I think that they just allow it or they encourage it, right? I think that that's super important to see what the national political discourse is, that it's toxic. But that toxicity has trickled all the way down. You mentioned the interviews that you did with 2 local elected officials, and I can tell you that a lot of our local really great lawmakers are thinking about not running again, right? And what does that do to our own community here in Las Cruces? I mean, that is like people who are really good public servants don't want to do that work. And then like, how do you recruit other people to do that work when they're going to get harassed online? Or they're going to get harassed in public comment. And so I think that it goes all the way from the presidential race all the way to your local school board.
Politics is such a big, broad field. I think you know that almost better than anybody. You've worked in journalism, on campaigns with groups like NMCAFe. How does that affect people working in those fields, even aside from like elected officials? How does it affect people like you?
I think that it really, it's disheartening. It just really hurts your soul to think about some of the stuff that people feel okay to say, right? Like that people are comfortable making, racist or homophobic comments, and like, that's all right. Nobody's going to say anything about that, or will be encouraged. And I think that is really damaging to our social fabric, where you feel like you can just say whatever you want and nobody's going to tell you anything about it, or will encourage, or will clap, or will hit the like button on these things. I think that really, it's just kind of soul crushing.
Sylvia Ulloa is the executive director of NMCAFe. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.